We're going to talk this morning about a topic that's a little uncomfortable. We're going to continue our series called Life Restored, and I'm going to read you a passage from Acts chapter 2, passage that I love. The model church that we really embark to be a church like that. We want to be believers like that. It's not going to be for you on the screen. I just want you to listen as I read it. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. They love the word. And we love the word around here. And fellowship and the breaking of bread and prayers. They love being together and they love praying together. We love being together as a church. We love praying together. And awe came upon every soul. And wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to as any as had need. And day by day attending the temple together. They broke bread in their homes. They received their food with glad and generous hearts. Praised God, having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who are being saved. Every church in America wants God to add to their number day by day, but not many of us want to live according to the first few verses I read, where we give generously, we love generously, we're in each other's homes, we're in each other's lives, we're praying for one another, we are dedicated to the word. When a church is dedicated to God's word, is generous with its resources, loves people radically, I'm telling you, God will add daily to that church, and that church will grow because healthy things have a way of growing. These are the principles that God has put in place. And so this morning, we want to be that church. We want to be those believers. And so we've been going through this list of things, not that we do to get better, not that we do these things to get saved, but these are things we do as we grow closer to God. And in the passage I just read to you, we saw their belief, man. They believed. And so week one, we talked about a restored life is a life that believes in God, trusts God, and trusts God when it doesn't make sense. Trust God with our soul, with every part of our life. And then we see that these people, they didn't just believe, man, they connected together. And so we talked about as a church how we connect together, why we serve the way that they served, why it is that we celebrate, why it is that we plan and we prepare the way that they planned and prepared for all that God was going to do. And this morning, we're going to talk about something that was evident in the Acts chapter 2 church. It's evident in our church, and it's something we do, but as soon as I say it, you're going to get real uncomfortable. Because for whatever reason, most of the world is comfortable with this topic, but we as Americans are not comfortable. It's actually a topic that Jesus talked about more than any other topic. It's the topic of giving. This morning, I want you to understand that when we get saved, when we trust Jesus, we begin doing things. We begin believing, we begin following him, we begin growing, and we begin giving. We give because we cannot outgive God. I want to read to you a passage in 2 Corinthians, and I'm going to read to you how this church responded with generosity. And it's not a church that you'd think of. Most of us, when we think of generous churches, we say, man, that church is generous because they're on the good side of the tracks. That must be a wealthy church. Must be a church that's in the good part of town. Must be a church where they got some generous people there because they're really wealthy and really blessed. Before we read any more passages this morning, I want to help you understand some things very clearly, and I'm just going to be blunt. Number one, Jesus spoke about money more than anything else. Number two, we do not preach a prosperity gospel at our church. Have not, will not. I will not do it. The prosperity gospel goes something like this. I get up here and I say, hey, y'all, you need to give because if you give, God will bless you. And he'll bless you the same way you bless him. You give him some money, he'll give you some money, and it's going to be real good. You keep giving. You just keep giving, and God's going to bless you. You plant your seed. You sow your seed. And they use some verses, they twist some scripture, and they make it sound like if you throw some money this way toward the church, God's going to give you a Mercedes. God's going to give you that dream. God's going to give you that vision. I want to tell you how the prosperity gospel works. It works one way, this way. Only this guy drives a new car. Only this guy is raising money for the jet. Only this guy gets to live in a mansion. Most of the time, it's on the backs of very poor people being used and abused and giving everything they have to the cause of one person or a handful of people. We don't preach that around here. That's an abuse of scripture. It's funny. The prosperity gospel does not do well in third world countries. They don't pipe it in there. Doesn't do real well in second world countries. Doesn't do real well in most countries. It does really well in this country. Because number one, we love money. Number two, we love thinking that if we give God something, he's obligated to give us back something. We love contractual relationships with God. We don't preach that here. Number two, I want you to understand that giving doesn't earn you any favor with God. If you're here this morning and you say, well, I'm going to heaven because I give. I'm not going to heaven because I give. I'm going to heaven because I trust Jesus. I don't give this morning to earn God's favor. He's no more satisfied with me because of the number I put on my check or the amount of zeros in my gift at the end of the year. God is not watching me saying, Mark, if you give this amount. No. Giving is something we do out of honor for God, out of worship. It's sacrificial. In the Old Testament, it was the same way. God was pleased with their sacrifice, not based on how big or how generous or how good, but that they did it to honor God. It's the heart of the matter, not the amount of the matter. And I want you to understand, fourthly, tithing is foundational in the Old Testament. There's this idea of tithing. We'll talk more about that here in just a minute. But the Old Testament principle was clear. The tithes came into the storehouse to provide for the Levites. We don't have Levites today. To provide for the house of God in very specific ways. And we're going to talk about how some of that transfers, how there's a principle there, and what Jesus has to say about tithing nonetheless. And really, why it is that we've all determined that tithing is either something we're going to do, like that's the goal, when really that was the baseline for the Old Testament, or it's something we've determined, I'll never do it. These are both attitudes we need to rid ourselves of. We don't need to make a number the thing. We need to make a generous lifestyle, a generous heart, the thing that we're striving for. So this morning, let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 8 about a people who do something that doesn't make sense. There are some conflicting notions here. There's poverty and wealth mentioned. There's grief. There's poverty and then generosity mentioned. It's weird. Read with me 2 Corinthians chapter 8. It says, we want you to know, brothers. Paul said, hey, I've been writing to you about all kinds of stuff. Can I tell you some good news, something crazy that's going on? He said, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. Before we go any farther, the churches of Macedonia were Gentile churches. These were not Hebrew churches. The church at Jerusalem was predominantly Hebrew. There were Gentiles and there were Greeks there, but there were not only Gentiles and Greeks there were many Hebrews. And the Hebrews were raised tithing. They were raised giving. Like many of us, they were raised in the church where they understood there were things you were supposed to do in the temple, in the storehouse, in the church setting. Well, these people in Macedonia, they had no idea about that. They just knew that Jesus had radically transformed their life, and so they wanted to be generous. Notice the way in which they were generous. For in a severe test of affliction, do you hear that? When they were at their lowest point. Every one of us have this determined in our heads. God, if I win the lottery, I promise I'm going to be generous. If I get a raise, I want to share some bad news with you. I got good news, but I got bad news. The bad news is this. Money is just an augmenter. It only shows you who you really are. If you're generous on your current level of income, I'm pretty sure you'll be generous if you hit the lottery tomorrow. If you get a huge raise, if you find some windfall, some family member dies, I promise, the principles upon which you're living right now, you'll live in that moment. But if you're mean about money now, stingy, don't give to people, you're going to be the same way. Kind of like this. You ever met somebody who's a jerk with nothing? Give them something, they're going to be a bigger jerk. Because now they can lord it over people. They can use it to manipulate people. And the heart they always had where they thought they were better than people, now they know they're better than people because they've got something, they've got money. Money is just an augmenter. And these people, in the absence of money, in a severe test of affliction, their abundance, now these are words that don't make sense. Affliction led to abundance of joy, and their extreme poverty have overflowed. Poverty doesn't usually lead to overflow, right? That's not how it works. It says poverty led to overflow in the wealth of generosity on their part. Read on. For they gave according to their need, to their means, and I can testify beyond their means. They said, we can do this. But you know what? I think we can even do this. And Paul said, are you sure? Notice this, begging us earnestly. Paul said, I didn't guilt them. Around here, we don't talk about money a lot. It's not because I'm afraid to talk about it. I don't want you to ever feel like you need to give at church because Pastor Mark's going to start preaching on it. We've already had a campaign this year where we raised cash to expand our kids' ministry. This morning, I'm not talking about money because money is tight. This morning, I'm not talking about money because we got some big campaign we're doing. That's not it at all. I'm talking about money because it's something that Jesus talked about, but I want to tell you, God has been good to us as a church. We don't have a need where we're like, well, I hope the offering's good this month. I get a report at the end of every month. At the end of June, like every month here lately, we were up 20% compared to last June. God has been very good to us in the area of giving, in the area of attendance, in the area of serving. God is blessing our church, and let me say this. I remember a few years ago when I was talking with some people about starting a church in downtown Portsmouth. And this was the notion, this was the way they would say it. Well, Mark, we're going to pray for you and we're excited for you, but you know, Portsmouth isn't the wealthiest community in Hampton Roads. I'm just afraid you'll get there and that church won't be able to support itself. I'm just afraid you'll get there and people won't have the resources to provide for a church that cares for people and is generous. And what I'm about to say, I'm not throwing any shade at you if you live here. They would say things like, you should go to Harborview. Y'all, I love Harborview. I eat at Harborview. I hang out in Harborview. I don't live in Harborview, and our church isn't in Harborview. There's new churches popping up in Harborview. I grew up at the beach, and I love Virginia Beach. I rode my bike there yesterday, had a blast on the boardwalk. I love the beach. Love it, love it, love it. A lot of people said, Mark, your church should move to Virginia Beach. There's a little more resources there. There's a little more money there. The church will be able to support itself better there. If you just have a bunch of people who can't support themselves, and I just remember thinking, wait a minute, what? By any measure, the poorest city in this state is still miles ahead of most cities around the world. That's just fundamentally true. Number two, if we're only going to send churches, church plants, missionaries to places that can support themselves, I guess we're just telling 80% of the world, sorry, the gospel can only afford to go here. So I just remember having a real big problem with that. Can I tell you, our church is 3.5 years old, and God has been very, very good to us. Some of you are fanning yourself saying, what about the AC? We have money to cover that problem. It came up this morning. We just didn't have the time. I promise this is not a reflection of our current financial situation. Let me make you a promise. There's some things I'll overlook. Air conditioning's not one of them. I'm going to be cool next weekend, all right? God has been good to us because we didn't make decisions based on income. We didn't go to where everybody was educated. We didn't look at the demographics and say, this is the growing part of town. This is the best part. It is not by mistake this morning that we are worshiping with the shipyard in front of us, Old Town up the road, and government housing behind us. That was a determined decision that we made as a church. We are not just for Old Town. We are not just for Siesta Gardens. We are not just for the shipyard. We are here with the gospel for all. And that means going places that maybe some other churches, church plants, or teams don't want to go to. And that's fine with us. That's fine with us. So I want to make very clear, Macedonia wasn't an attractional place for a lot of people to go to. But God's church was on the move, and they were blessed. So notice this. They were begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. They said, it's a blessing to be generous. Some of you aren't there yet. By the end of this message, I want to help you understand what it takes to get to the joyful generosity part of giving. But some of you are still at the part where you're like, well, I'll give if Pastor Mark says I have to. Well, I'll give if there's a need. If there's a kids program, I'll give. I want you to get to the place where you're looking to be generous. These people were saying, wait, there's an issue? Let us give. But they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us. I want to remind you what these Macedonians are giving to because it's crazy who they were giving to. The Hebrew church was in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was mainly Hebrews. And the Hebrews, a few years prior to Jesus coming, didn't like anybody who wasn't Hebrew. They didn't hang out with Macedonians. They talked down to the Macedonians. They said, your skin color is wrong. Your culture is wrong. We don't get along. You're the wrong race. We don't get along. And now those people that look down on them, now they're united not by politics. The politics are still very different in these two communities. Their economies are very different. They have different ideas of who should run the world. But these Christians love these Christians. And so these Christians gave to these Christians over here, who generations before, they probably had said some things about them before they met Jesus, but they said, you know what? We're united by Christ, so we're going to give to this, and we're going to give big. We're going to give generously. I want you to understand 4 simple truths about giving this morning from this passage. Number 1, giving reveals your heart. Okay, we see the Macedonian Christians. They have a heart that is not wound up in things, not bound up in stuff, not bound up in money. It's bound up in people. They cared more about people than they cared about stuff. I want you to live a life where when somebody looks at the sum total of your life, they say, no doubt about it, they had stuff. Many of you have cars and homes, but their life was lived in love of people. They pursued people. They loved people. Your heart and my heart is revealed in what we do with our money. Jesus put it this way. He said, where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Your heart follows your money. Some of you understand this because you've got an app where you follow some stocks. I've told y'all before, I follow the FedEx stock religiously because I've got some money tied up there and because I work there. And if they plummet real quick overnight, I want to know what's going on with Fred Smith and what's going on with the board because I have employment there. I have money tied up there. My heart is there because my treasure's there. Right? When you start giving to the church, suddenly you care what they're doing to reach people. Suddenly you care what they're doing to make a difference in the world. And so our heart kind of reveals who we are and what we do. This group of people, they loved people. They loved people more than things. I want to tell you a little bit about money. Money's changed a lot. Early on in human history, money was determined by land and animals, right? Because that was how we determined wealth. That's why when Abraham was around, we aren't told about gold necessarily. We're told about how many sheep he had, how many oxen he had, how many goats he had. And so back then, when you walked around, people would know, man, he's got a lot of herds. He's wealthy. I was in Oklahoma a couple of years ago, and I met somebody who was a family member of a family member of a family member, and I found out he owned some cattle. I was like, whoa, cool, you got a ranch? Awesome. How many cows you got? And it got really quiet. He walked up and he said, hey, man, I know you meant nothing by it. But you don't ever ask somebody that. I said, why? He said, cattle have a dollar amount. And if I were to tell you how many cattle I have, I'm basically telling you my net worth. I said, I get it. That's how the world used to work. And in some parts of our country, it still works that way. But then when Jesus came on the scene, things had changed. There was still land, there were still animals, but now there was gold coins because the Romans had spread out this currency, and now people were tied to a financial, like a thing you could hold, a dollar, a coin. And we've lived in this world. We're transitioning out of that world now, though, because a lot of us, man, you could take my wallet, you ain't gonna get nothing out of it. There's no money in there. I don't hold money that way. Now we have digital currency, and we can view our money on our screen. We can send some money to people, phone to phone. But the world Jesus was in had changed, and now the world we're in is changing. But all throughout those periods, the same thing was true. People cared more about money than people. Here's how they would do it. In the very first part of the Old Testament, they would move the landmarks. There was this land. Let's say this section of the stage was my land. That section of the stage was your land. There was a landmark. I would come out at night, and what I would do is I would take the landmark, and I'd move it. So if this is the landmark, I'd be like, hey, while you're asleep, my land just got bigger. I stole from you and you didn't know it. You didn't notice because I moved it really quickly and really subtly. Then money came along and pickpocketing became a thing, right? I took your money when you weren't looking. And now in our digital age, some of you are getting emails from people saying, hey, I got some money I want to give you. And you know what they really want. They want to take your money. It doesn't matter what kind of money or what kind of wealth we're talking about. The human heart stays the same. So Jesus isn't necessarily talking just about money. He's really talking about our hearts, all right? So giving is what reveals our hearts, but then giving is countercultural. The Macedonians lived in a world where everybody lived the way we live. You get what you can, you save what you can, and you only spend on yourself, and it's all about you. And they said, no, we're gonna care about people who are in a different country, who don't speak the same language, but they're united with us by Jesus. So it's countercultural because they're crossing cultural lines. It's also countercultural because it goes against everything we're taught. You are taught that what you earn is yours and only yours, and you should do with it what you want to care for those who are closest to you. And the gospel is radical in that it says, this life isn't about you. Jesus gave knowing that, man, many would never receive. He died knowing that many would mock and spit and never believe. Jesus gives regardless of the blessing or the benefit that may come his way. And we're called to do the same. But really what we need to see is giving is a result of transformation. How can I give in a countercultural way? How can I give of myself in a way that reveals a heart that loves people? There's got to be a transformation in our hearts. Some of us have tried to do the thing before the transformation. So we go to church, we read the Bible, we give money to the church, we get baptized, we do these things, but if there's no transformation, they just feel empty. I've known a lot of people who do this. They do religious things. It's kind of like Pontius Pilate when he didn't want to really deal with what was going on, so he brought out this bowl and he washed his hands. That was a religious ceremony. He was trying to make himself feel better by doing something religious. That was something the high priests would do, and it didn't work. It really bothered him because some of us go through life and we do the things, but we're not doing them for the right reason. God doesn't just want you this morning to do the thing. He wants you to trust him and follow him, and that's really what I want to focus on this morning. So the fourth truth is this: giving is an overflow of surrender and dependence. Remember how we read in that passage, it said their poverty led to wealth? Those things don't work. Surrender and dependence, those are two counterintuitive notions to us, and here's why. Number one, because we're human and we want to be independent. From the moment we can walk, we're running from mom. From the moment we have stuff, it's all about us. We don't want to be dependent on someone. And number two, by nature, we don't want to surrender. And especially because we're raised in an American culture where we'll never give in. It's all about us. We're the winner. And God says, no, I want you to surrender. Not just your heart. Some of us surrender and say, God, I want my soul to go to heaven. I trust you with my soul. I trust you with my relationship. I trust you with my emotional well-being. I trust you with all this, but my money, my giving, serving, no, I don't trust you with my time. And God's saying, it's not about the money. It's not about the time. It's about the fact that you're not willing to surrender this thing, this idea, this part of your life. And here's the best way I can explain it and I can understand it. Surrender leads to dependence. And that's why we have an issue with it. We don't want to depend on anybody else. All of us have this dream. I have it and you have it. I want to get to the place where I have enough money, I have enough stuff, I have enough things, where I'm not dependent on my job. I'm not dependent on my family. I'm not dependent on anyone else. I've done it, I've owned it, I've proven it, and I'm independent. And God says, I want you to learn to depend on me, not money. Nothing wrong with having money, by the way, but he said, Paul wrote, look, tell those of you that have wealth not to place their faith in wealth because that can disappear tomorrow. Guys, I'm not saying don't store. The book of Proverbs is clear. You should make money, save it, do what's right with it, but you shouldn't place your hope of your soul in money. So surrender leads to dependence, and some of us have some issues there. But then dependence leads to joyful generosity. Here's what I mean. Some of you know people like this, where they're generous and you don't even understand how they're generous, but they just say things like, and they're not saying it in a pithy or empty way, but they're like, God is going to provide. God has come through in the past. I believe God will provide. And they're not stupid with money, but they're kind of a little over. You're like, pull that back a little bit. Why are you being so nice to people? Draw that back. I used to work for a guy, man. He was always generous with his employees. He would find out there was a need. He would take care of it. And I knew he had the money to do it. But sometimes I'd come alongside and be like, Don, they're taking advantage of you. And he would say, they can do that, but I still get the blessing of being generous. This is my choice. And he'd say, Mark, I know they're doing that. This is my choice. Some will take advantage, but I get to choose to be generous. I want you to get to the point where what other people do or don't do doesn't bother you. I'm going to live a joyfully generous life. I'm concerned that most of us are stuck between dependence and surrender. It is hard to depend on God when we're raised to depend on ourselves. I can remember when I was growing up, my mom was a single mom, and we at times, we really did depend on the generosity of others. For food, for finances, it was tough. For a couple of years, every month it was $2.30 some odd cents. Like that's how close our budget was at the end of the month. That's if no car broke down. That's if gas did not go up. I mean, we were on the edge constantly. I can remember that. But my mom raised me and always made clear to me that when you make money, you should be generous. You should be generous at church. You need to give. You need to be a generous person with your time. You need to be generous to other people. She would find other single moms who had it worse than us, and she would find ways to be generous. You know, years later, she got rid of that leech called, a child that didn't support himself, named Mark, right? Only child syndrome. Always had to have new shoes. We couldn't afford new shoes. I was always asking for stuff. Once I finally got out of the home and she did a little better financially, she's now able to be generous to single moms. A lot of times in our church, when she finds out about something, she's going to take care of it because that generosity is stuck with her. When she had a little bit, she was generous. When God blessed her with more, she was generous. Don't tell yourself you're going to be generous later. You're going to be as generous later often as you are now. But this dependence is hard, especially for us guys. I don't want to have to depend on God. It's funny, I depend on him for salvation. I could never earn it. But in this area, we have a way of trying to do it ourselves. So I want to be practical. I'm going to tell you some things that have helped us. I'm going to be practical, and then I'm going to close it up with spiritual. So I'm going to go practical here just for just a second. The word doesn't just tell us to be generous. It actually tells us how to be generous. The Bible has great principles for you. This is why we do financial peace every year. We did it last year. We're going to do it again this fall. If you're here this morning, I want you to understand the reason most of us don't talk about money is because we don't know enough about money. Some of us don't even know what we make. You don't know what you make until you get the statement at the end of April. Like, that's not the way you should be living your life. God has a plan for you, not just to live a life that is generous, but can afford to be generous. Stop living a life without a budget. So my first encouragement to you this morning, if you don't have a budget, you need a budget. Oh, Pastor Mark, we just need to depend on God. You need to depend on God once you put the budget together that shows how you need to depend on God. Some of you don't even know how much to depend on God. You don't know how short you are or over you are because you don't know what's coming in and what's going out. The Bible is clear. Look, the wise man prepares. The wise man makes a plan. And it's not just to hoard stuff. It's to be generous. So if you haven't gone through financial peace, I'd encourage you to go through financial peace. You need a budget. Most couples, if they'll have a 15-minute conversation every week about finances, they can revolutionize how much money they have and what they do with it. My wife and I years ago made a plan. We made a determined effort, and we always gave to the church, but then after we gave, we'd set aside money that we could have spent eating out, that we could have spent on a newer car, that we could have spent doing fun things with, but we always set that money aside because we said we want to buy rental property. That's what we want to do. We want to have this asset, and that brings me to number 2. Some of us in this building, like Christians, we got to get better at purchasing assets instead of liabilities. The New Testament church, did you notice how they sold their possessions? Many of them, we found out in Acts, sold land. They bought things that produced income. They did not buy things that lost value. All right, they were wise. You can buy things that actually grow in value. A business that's earning money, property that has rental income. A boat does not usually produce income. It's usually a liability and loses value. All right? A new car is fancy, is great. There's nothing wrong with having a new car. But if I were you, I would encourage you to get your assets before your liabilities. We get it reversed. We go out and we get every liability we can get our hands on. I want to get a car with a big payment. I want to get a house with a big payment that I can't afford. I want to get all these things that I can't really afford, and then I'll begin putting some money away. Purchase assets, not liabilities. Number 3, some of you need to take full advantage of the power of automation. I am not going to spend this entire message being practical because I don't want you to think, well, we came to church, we learned a bunch of financial. I want to help you, but I want you to see why I'm helping you. The reason I automate everything is because I'm super forgetful. I don't remember to pay my power bill sometimes, so I had to automate it. I don't remember which gas bill goes to which property, so I automate it. My wife and I automate our giving at church. And this is the comma I have here. Automate, but plan for spontaneous. So our bills are automated, our giving's automated, but I can come to church. And a couple of weeks ago, some of you did this. We had a guy come in talking about missions, and it moved your heart. So you said, I want to give toward our missionaries in Japan, and you did that. It's the idea of, I'm going to give, and then when I want to, I'm going to be spontaneous. When God moves my heart, and I see a couple in need, or I see a single mom in need, I'm going to be generous. I'm going to pull out my checkbook. I'm going to pull out my phone and text, give, and I'm going to do what I need to do because God has put it on my heart. You need to automate as much as you can, but still have room for spontaneity. And then number 4, most of us don't do this. You just need to pray about giving. You pray about everything else, pray about this. Pray about it and be honest with God. Say, God, this is what I understand. This is what I know. This is what I know to be true. This is where I've been. This is what I've been doing. And God, I'm trusting you that I'm going to grow in this area. Maybe it's not the amount that needs to change. Maybe it's your heart. You're like, God, I've been giving for years and I hate it. I just hate it. God, change my heart. Maybe it's not the amount. Maybe it's how you give. You say, God, what I've been doing is I'm super forgetful. I don't always do it right. God, help me to create a plan, get a budget together where I know this is what I can do and this is when I can go above and beyond. These are the times of year where there's bonuses involved. And when I'm doing these things, I'm going to be generous to you. But then I want to read you a very sobering passage of Scripture. I don't want you to get to the end of this message and say, well, today God has put on my heart giving, so I need to give, and that's what I need to do. I want to read you what Jesus said to some people who had gone over and above in the area of giving, but had missed it in other parts of their life. Matthew 23, verse 23, Jesus said to their face, by the way, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin. This is crazy. They tithed everything, and then when they got home, they went to their indoor garden, kind of like near their kitchen sink, and they were like, oh no, I've grown cumin, I've grown dill. And they would clip these leaves. They were so precise, they would tithe down to the nanocent. You know what I'm saying? Because they wanted to completely obey the law. But you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Jesus was not saying, forget giving. He was saying, you've done giving, but you don't care about people. I don't want one or the other. I want both. So this morning, if you're not giving, I'm not saying, like, hey, you just start giving and you'll be all right. I want you to understand, be faithful. Pursue justice and mercy and faithfulness and giving. These Pharisees had taken God and turned him into a checklist of boxes. I do not want you walking out of here with a checklist of boxes. I want you walking out of here saying, God, I'm going to pursue what matters. And you've made clear that giving matters. When we give to good things, it not only makes good things happen in our community, it begins to transform my heart. And I'm not dependent on that money, that thing, that land, that idea. I'm beginning to depend on you. And surrender hurts. It's difficult at first, but I'm beginning to embrace surrender and realize that I can really trust you with every part of my life. And now I see you for who you really are. You're not just the God of my soul. You're the God of my emotions. You're the God of my finances. You have my back in this. No, you didn't promise me a Mercedes or a mansion. No, you didn't but you did say you'd take care of me. You promised us that you would care for us. And to the disciples, it was true. And for me, it's true. And yeah, a lot of them died awful deaths pursuing your goal, pursuing your ministry. But God, you cared for them. You provided for them. And they died a part of something much bigger than any other part of human history. Guys, the prosperity gospel has nothing to offer us except vanity and emptiness. But the full gospel, the real gospel says, you're bigger than money. You're bigger than just what you have. So I want to close this way. If you're here and you're a non-believer, I want to make very clear, you don't need to give this morning. That's not the type of church we are. We don't want people just throwing money in the plate. the first thing you need to do is surrender your heart to God. That's where everybody starts. If you're here this morning and you're a believer, part of surrender is surrendering every part of our lives, and you may need to begin praying about what it is that God would do in this area of giving in your life. Since I've been a kid, I've understood tithing to be a good principle. Some of you, tithing is the goal. You're like, I want to get there one day. For some of you, tithing is the base. You're like, I start there and I move up. I don't ever want us to be tied to just a thing like, if I get there, I've arrived. I want us to be generous people who live according to God's principles and determine I'm going to give, and then I'm going to go above and beyond, and I'm going to be generous, and I'm not going to limit God with an amount or a percentage, but I'm also not going to stop short and say, no, I'll never go that high. I'll never go that low. I want you to begin praying about it. And this is the part that it's going to make you a little uncomfortable. If you're here this morning and you're struggling with this, I hope you don't just throw money in the plate this morning to make yourself feel better. I hope you'll pray and talk to God about this. When I give, God blesses, God is faithful. It is not a tit for tat. I am not a wealthy man because God blessed me because I started giving. I am not a wealthy man, first of all, but I've been provided for. My wife and I, we have been very, very well protected. When we first got married, we determined to give. And then I had a surgery. I was still in college, and we were running out of money quickly. We had a little bit in savings. And I remember every month we were pulling money out of savings because we continued our giving to the church. And we were faithful to that. And God has been faithful to us. We've never made a 6 figures between the two of us in any given year. My wife has been a teacher, not because of the income, because she loved kids. And I quickly out of college pursued ministry and worked at FedEx. We've never made a lot of money in a given year, but God's been very faithful to us. Our bills are paid. We're well protected. We can afford some hard times that have come in the last few years due to some physical things we've had to pay a lot of doctor's bills for. God's got me, and I'm not worried about that. And I want you to understand how freeing it is to fully trust God and say, God, I'm going to be generous. I'm going to do what you've called me to do. This is true in every area of your life. It's true of your emotions. It's true of your time, your talent, your marriage. God doesn't owe me a thing, but he's been so good to me. And if I could encourage you this morning to begin trusting God, that is what I want to do. Not because we need it. God's been good to our church. Not because we're building something next year. We have no plans. This morning, I just want us to be faithful to God in this area. I want to do it as an individual. I want you to do it as an individual. And I want God to be honored in our church in the midst of struggles. When the economy's good, when the economy's bad, I want to be a church that God says, look at you. Honoring me, being generous in the community, being generous to my kingdom around the world. Because it's who you are. It's not just something you do.